Today we're going to talk about economic integration and international relations with China and the West. And with us today is Professor Stephen Chan. So thank you very much, Prof. Would you like to give a few introductory remarks?
I'm very, very happy to be talking with you. It's been some time since I've been to Ghana, but I have been, and I've traveled all over Africa, both as an international civil servant and as an academic, and also still to this day involved in diplomatic issues. Apart from being a professor of world politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, I've also done things like foreign services in different parts of Africa, in Eritrea, for instance, Ethiopia. So I'm very, very familiar with the needs of African diplomacy and of many, many ambassadors from Africa who are my good friends.
Wow. Thanks for that, and thanks for joining us. Now, Prof, what do you think is the role of Africa in world politics? I mean, there's a lot going on, and Africa has found itself in a peculiar situation. What do you actually think is the role of Africa in the world politics as it is now?
Well, up to this point in time, Africa hasn't punched its weight in world politics. I think it can. I think a lot of this depends on the professionalization of the diplomatic corps, and also, of course, depends very much on presidents and senior political figures understanding the difficult technical nature of diplomacy. Some of your best ambassadors are very, very good indeed, but not all of them are given freedom to operate as full ambassadors by their presidents and by their senior ministers. So the recognition that this is a professional game is of extreme importance for the future of Africa.
Now, African countries have become an attractive business destination in the world due to economic rise in natural resources. Now, you've got many African countries with a lot of resources. Ghana, for instance, has a lot of gold. You've got DRC. You've got quite a few other countries that have quite a number of natural resources. And one would think that would earn them some chance in global politics. How do you think that Africa should deal with the West and Asia, and also among themselves in terms of their natural resources?
I think I have a very simple, a very straightforward answer to that. Of course, Africa has been blessed for a long time, natural resources. European powers scrambled for those resources. But I think that the key point about African trade diplomacy today should be that there should not be any arrangements made with foreign powers regarding the exploitation of African resources unless those foreign powers are prepared to put in an industrialization package. In other words, no more raw materials from Africa, processed materials. But that means that in processing these materials within Africa itself, industrialization begins. Industrialization requires technical application. Knock-on effect, which is fundamental. The export of raw materials is no longer, I think, any more feasible. That just continues a colonial game. In the new world, in which Africa is truly independent, with truly knowledgeable diplomacy, it has to involve a degree of processing. Those who want to benefit from African resources have got to invent the processing of these raw materials.
Right. So actual processing of raw materials before it goes out is our stake in there.
Absolutely. For instance, there was a scandal very, very recently that Nigeria was exporting so much crude oil, but didn't refine any, would re-import their own oil refined by somebody else. So you want to be able to do those things and insist that the major petroleum companies, the major mining companies, invest backwards into making Africa self-sufficient, not just in terms of raw materials, but the manufacturing process that makes these raw materials so valuable to the West.
Right. And does that solve the sustainable growth and development problem as well. Are you saying by this that once we don't just take the raw material and ship it out to be processed and then we buy it back, but rather we get the raw materials, process it, add value to it before it goes out, gives us a better state? But does this actually ensure sustainable growth and development in Africa?
It will help to ensure sustainable growth. However, there's one major caveat here, a major caution. You don't want to make the same mistakes that the West has made and that China has made, and you don't want to pollute your environment. So when you enter into the realm of processing, when you develop your manufacturing capacity, this has to be done with the cleanest, most modern, most ecologically beneficial technologies. Africa can take a lead here. They can process their materials and at the same time show the world how to do this and have a clean environment.
So sort of responsible and being responsible in the way we process it as well. So
Yeah.
we can take care of the earth as well. Now, how does Africa ensure that it's not exploited by the West and Asia, who are far advanced and who have far more experience in doing what they do?
It's a good question, but in fact, there are good examples in Africa itself of how to push back diplomatically. The two key examples with regard to African countries and China, for instance, those two key examples are Angola. They've learned very, very well, very expertly, how to push back in negotiations with China. And the other is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, of course, was not colonized and managed to retain its independence, but even defeated a large Italian army trying to invade Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa. So what you have in both countries, two very different countries, but particularly in Ethiopia, a very high technocratic level. You have a prime minister, PhD in computer technology. He understands the modern world. You have ministers in his cabinet who are young, who are technocratic, who speak Chinese. There's no way that the Chinese can pull the wool over their faces, over their eyes, because they can hear all the back chat. The Chinese know that they're eavesdropping as well. All of the stuff that you need for diplomacy to work, to understand back chat, understand background, to be able to lobby behind the scenes. The Ethiopians are getting really, really good at this now. I recently hosted the minister from the Prime Minister's office in London. He was my guest at my university. And I have to tell you, this man was himself a PhD. He himself was very highly educated, mayor of Addis, one of the fastest growing cities in Africa. And this man was an expert. I couldn't think of a Western planet who was in his league. So what you've got to do is have an inferiority complex. You can't just assert your right, oh, we're compromised for the world owes us a living. You've got to go there and punch your weight. In order to punch your weight, you know what you're doing, you have to research it, you have to trust your advisors, and you've got to speak languages. Of course, what you want to do is also demand that the world starts learning to speak your languages. And that way it becomes a two-way street.
Wow. Wow. That's quite insightful. Now, but if you look also at, I mean, from what you've even mentioned now, you can actually see that the game is actually tilting from Africa dealing more with the West to Africa dealing with Asia in terms of business and economic affairs and all that.
Don't forget the West also has trouble dealing with Asia. I mean, the explosion of China onto the international arena has caught even the United States by surprise. You can see this in some of the reactions of President Donald Trump, for instance.
Exactly.
He had no idea what he's doing half the time with Asia, let alone some other things. So it's a learning curve for everybody. Don't forget the Asians, the Chinese in particular, also have a learning curve with regard to Africa. It's well known they've been extremely clumsy from time to time. There's no doubting that. It's even completely accurate to say that sometimes their people have been racist. I'm Chinese. I'm prepared to admit that. Many mistakes, but you've got to overcome mistakes. And you've got to learn things, and not just the Chinese. Let me give you an example. There was a Chinese trade delegation came to Zimbabwe, which needs Chinese help, and they were welcomed with signs that were written in Korean. This is an insult. We're all different. It's like Akan is different from Nigerian languages. They're not the same. And you have basic research like that and get it right. So it's two-way. One time it may be one side insulting the other out of ignorance, and other times it's the other side insulting the opposite partner again out of ignorance. You've got to take ignorance out of the equation.
We've got to take ignorance out of the equation. That's quite a deep statement. Yeah, and so you agree with the fact that everybody's looking at their interests, and so respect is quite key in the relationship we have with either party. So the relationship that Africa has with the West and the relationship that it has with Asia, and you're saying that ignorance has to be taken out of the equation. Now, moving back into the arena of diplomacy, how does Africa now deal with China, Europe, and America? Should we have a one-size-fits-all approach, or do you think that Africa would have a tailor-made approach for each of these areas? Because they seem to have their own differences.
I think you've got to, in modern diplomacy, have experts who can help you tailor-make your diplomacy, bespoke your diplomacy for each different country or each different organization. So, for instance, your ambassador to the United States should be somebody, a Ghanaian, who's taken a PhD from Princeton or Harvard or Stanford, Columbia, someplace like that. Your ambassador to China should be someone who can speak Chinese. If you've got a special mission, for instance, let's say you're dealing with Korea, you want to make a special deal with Samsung telephones to invest in your country, you better send an ambassador who understands cell phone technology. So if you don't put in the expertise, no one is going to give you a helping hand. They're just going to say, oh, look, this person doesn't know what he's doing. Let's take him for a ride. We'd do the same. Oh, look, that man doesn't know what he's doing. Let's see what advantage we can gain. So you've got to send out people who put in the homework.
Wow. Indeed. So indeed, it's quite a deep statement there, knowledge being power, because you obviously have to have knowledge of the area, knowledge of what you're actually going to do there, knowledge of the particular subject area you're talking about. If it's about making a lot more films, then you need somebody who is technologically inclined. If it's about culture, you need somebody who has actually it's a bit versed in the culture over there to be able to have that a smooth collaboration with these countries.
Yes, and I'll give you an example of a country that does this very well, an Asian example. We don't often think about the Japanese, but you'll find that almost every single Japanese ambassador to an African country was, first of all, when he was a young man or a young woman, a volunteer to an African country, helping with community schemes.
Wow.
They fell in love with the place. And so there's a special diplomatic stream in the Japanese Foreign Service, whereby these people will be particularly assigned to African locations. They learned about the place when they were young, and they developed an affection for it, and that they now specialize in it. So the Japanese send out, as a matter of course, when it comes to Africa, people who are familiar with the country to which they're being assigned, people who've got affection, some sympathy, some sense of wanting to outreach to that particular country. I was in Zimbabwe just last year, and the Japanese ambassador, he entertained me for dinner, Ambassador Iwado. My goodness, he knew Zimbabwe like the back of his hand, because he had been a young man there, fell in love with the place, was really, really happy to be back as the ambassador. And he just got on with the local people like nothing on earth. So you need that kind of familiarity as well as the homework. Because, of course, things change, countries change. They're not like they were when you were a young man or a young woman. So constant learning, not just learning one time, constant upgrading of your knowledge, together with sympathy and understanding of the local culture as best an outsider can, because, of course, it's impossible to be fully understanding of someone else's culture. But as best an outsider can, you need those combinations together with technical expertise and skill in specialist subjects, like, for instance, as I said, if you're dealing with South Korea, you're talking about Samsung, you need to have somebody who understands cell phone technology.
So, from what you're saying, there's got to be some strategy to it. It's not just about the wholesale, just send anyone there, just send a senior person there, but there's got to be some strategy to it, and which actually helps with your sort of diplomatic relations with whichever country you are dealing with. Now, how does this work with career, those who have gone into career diplomacy? What do you think, how does this play out for those who have just built up their career in diplomacy, have had no experience in terms of the culture where they're going and all that, and have not built that kind of tact? What's up for them?
Basically, if your foreign ministry doesn't provide the training, I think it's up to you as a young professional person to undertake at least a little bit of language training. For instance, reach out to the local university, that kind of thing, perfectly possible. Make that kind of effort. But that shows goodwill. When you're at a diplomatic reception and you're greeting your host and you're able to say a few sentences to your host in his language, just watch the smile on that person's face. He's instantly going to be warm towards you. He's going to say, oh, look, let's exchange cards. Come and see me. Maybe we can discuss something of mutual interest to both our countries. But if you're hiding in a corner because you can't understand what's going on, that's going to come to you.
Okay, exactly. Yeah, that's quite an interesting part. I'm sure that our members will be quite interested in that part of it. Now, do you think holistically, where do you think Africa should focus? Do you think Africa should focus on economic and commercial diplomacy? If you can elaborate on that a bit.
Yes, I think there should be an emphasis on trade diplomacy and also on diplomacy with regard to the international lending agencies. Right now, one of the biggest exports of Africa is debt repayment. You guys, A, shouldn't get into so much debt, but that's a political decision, obviously. But then you really want to find out how to diplomatically roll over, extend, reduce the debt. This is specialist diplomacy. So if you try to do this and you don't understand economics, then you're in the wrong game. So for something like this, you don't want to spend the rest of your lives paying off debt, whether it was wise to incur that debt or not, but you do want to be able to manage it in a way which does not jeopardize your development prospects. So those people who are assigned to that particular portfolio, people who are assigned to Washington, D.C. and have to deal with the World Bank and the IMF, for instance, they'd better be A-class economists. You've got no business being sent there if you're not. So all of those specialities, and also things to do with trade diplomacy, the rules of the World Trade Organization, for instance, a full understanding of how international trade agreements work, an understanding of how best to negotiate a trade deal. Now, I'm not just saying this with Africa in mind. Right now, Great Britain, where I live, is having a very great deal of trouble taking itself away from the European Union. They've got no idea how to negotiate an exit from all the trade deals. So British ministers can't do that. So you're not alone, but you've got to learn as best you can. Be better than the British in trying to do things like right now it's not hard, so you should be able to do this, okay?
Exactly. Now, even mentioning EU brings to mind the role of the African Union back here in Africa. I mean, there have been calls for the African Union to be given supranational powers, just like the EU, where all the European countries submit to the laws the laws made on EU. Some of them automatically get entrenched in the laws of the EU member countries and all that. Now, what would you say about those calls for African Union to be given that kind of supranational power? And what will you say is the advantage there, if there is?
It can be done on stages. Don't forget, in many African countries, the rule of law, of national law, is often not upheld. So if you would have continental supranational law, that's just singing in the wind. However, I do think there should be international, African-wide respect for human rights. This is something which can be applied throughout Africa, and you have your own human rights court. It's no good complaining about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, if you yourself don't put something into place which allows Africans to sit in justice over other Africans. You just can't say that Africans should escape justice. So it has to be a human rights set of laws that are laws with teeth. In other words, people can be brought to trial before the African Union Court. I think there's one other very, very important thing the African Union has got to do. It's got to be serious about rapid mobilization of peacekeeping soldiers. Right now, the reason why the French get there first is because the French can get there first. Africa can't. So all the technologies are trying to imitate European armies, but without the transport mechanisms. So it's no good complaining the French came and sort of drove back the rebels in Mali when the rapid deployment African Union force just couldn't get there. And the French could get there overnight. So the real key in terms of peacekeeping and rapid deployment in Africa is not more and more soldiers and more tanks. It's more and more transport helicopters and transport aircraft to get the soldiers there. So that should be a priority. Africa needs to stop being the place of endless wars. But in order to be able to make it a peaceful place, you do have to have coordinated military action that can send troops to end insurrections and to bring to justice before an African Union Court of Human Rights those who are perpetrating terrorism.
Right. So you would say just take the most important aspects that would sort of bring some, rather than making it a blanket supranational power,
yes,
just like the EU, take a few key steps, things around human rights, things around rapid mobilization of our logistics and forces and all that.
Yes. If you're going to start with anything, peace and justice, that's where you start. They have immediate benefits for African people. Even the European Union started with coal and steel. When it began after World War II, it did nothing else but coal and steel. From those small foundations and getting those foundations right, they're able to spread out to everything else. If you don't get key elements right and make them work, then it's useless to try to think about everything else all in one go. It's a dream. We would all love to have a proper African Union. It was the dream of Kwame Nkrumah, for instance. And it's a dream that people like Thabo Mbeki continued to hold while he was president of South Africa. I think it's a dream for African people and the African diaspora almost everywhere that one day there'll be a United States of Africa. But you've got to get one or two things right. From there you can grow and then make step by step the dream a reality. The whole dream doesn't come all at once. We don't live with fairy godmothers.
Now, talking about getting one or two things right, what will you say are some of the things that you think, in your personal opinion, Africa has not got right in terms of their international relations and diplomacy in general? What will you say, just in your opinion?
I think that one of the things that Africa needs to do is to start looking for people who've got the caliber of the previous United Nations Secretary General, Kofi Annan. I'm going to be very honest here. I think that Kofi got off to a very slow start. I was very critical of him when he was Under Secretary General, for instance. But I have to say that, say about 1-2 years into his Secretary Generalship of the UN, he became the real deal. He could do stuff. He knew how to do stuff. He was not afraid to learn. He set an example. It was very gentlemanly. To his last days, he was a gentleman. Whenever I would meet him, he was so gracious. It was unbelievable. Never looked down on anyone, but by God, two things. Did he know his stuff? Oh, yes. Was he prepared to put the boot in? Oh, yes. Yeah. You've got to have that kind of combination of graciousness and at the same time a hard edge. And that kind of combination, together with good judgment, they're the kinds of qualities that we're looking for in African diplomats, in foreign ministers, preferably also in presidents, of course. But we want this to very, very much come into the realm of diplomacy.
Mm. Mm. So we need to be resourced, and I'm sure that what we're doing here at African Forum for Diplomacy will be one of the first steps, helping build sort of young people to get to the point where they will be the Kofi Annans of the future.
I'm very much hoping that before I pass away from this planet Earth, I shall meet the Kofi Annan of the future. Anything that you can do with your help and your education, your public outreach, is going to be part of building not just the next Kofi Annan, let's say the whole generation of male and female Kofi Annans of the future.
Exactly. So finally, how does Africa win itself of external powers like China has done in the recent past?
China, you've got to remember, went through very hard times when it was trying to develop itself. Chinese people have got this saying that sometimes you've got to eat bitterness. If you eat bitterness now, you could eat sweetness later. Wanting to have everything all at once is, as I say, fairy godmother land. You've got to put in the work. You've got to put in the effort. You've got to gain the knowledge. And above all, and this is what the Chinese did, they had to learn from their mistakes. I could write a whole book on all of the mistakes that Chairman Mao made. Terrible mistakes. Millions of people died for his mistakes. Have they learned? I think they've learned, not totally, but a very great deal. So you've got to get out there, you've got to learn, you've got to do things. Don't rely on other people to do things for you. Oh, look, here's a nice tempting bank loan from America, or a nice tempting line of liquidity from China, or another sort of big debt that's being offered to us from the IMF. You've got to basically start putting it together for yourselves. It's your country, it's your continent. Bloody well go out there and do it.
Go out there and do it. Thank you very much, Prof. And to round it off, what will be your last word? What will be your final words to our audience right now in terms of economic integration and international relations with China and the West, and basically diplomacy in general?
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, but be knowledgeable. It's not just bravado for the sake of bravado. Don't be afraid because you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you're just being foolish. So the two go together, courage and knowledge.
Courage and knowledge. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this afternoon. And it's been very much an insightful discussion. I'm sure that our participants here at African Forum for Diplomacy will be so happy about this and will be able to learn a bit more from it. And I'm sure that in the very near future,
we'll be seeing the great African global leaders that we're expecting out of this. So thank you very much.
Thanking you. My pleasure.
Pleasure.